We are going to talk about the new Blue Party and what impact our next guests think it can have on the Ontario political firmament. But first, we should point out that Jim Karahalios is suing the Ontario PC Party for what he says are irregularities in the presidential election the party held 2 years ago. And we should add that Karahalios previously sued the federal Conservatives for depriving him of the right to run for their leadership earlier this year, a case which Karahalios eventually won. And again, more on this later in our discussion. Meanwhile, it wasn't that long ago that Doug Ford got elected to bring his particular brand of populist, disruptive conservatism to Queen's Park. He loved picking fights with the media and stirring the pot. But since the pandemic, back in March, it's been a very different Ford, governing more like a moderate, pragmatic, progressive conservative, and often complimenting the media for its work. Even the Toronto Star. What's going on here? Well, let's find out as we welcome in Churchill Meadows, Mississauga, Jasveen Rattan, a 2019 candidate for the Federal Conservatives and Director of Policy for PC Women in Politics. And in the provincial capital, on the waterfront, there's Donald Blair, head of PivotWorks Business Systems and a longtime PC Party backroom guy. In the annex, Melissa Lanceman, Vice President, National Public Affairs for Enterprise Canada. She also ran Doug Ford's 2018 election war room. And just a stone's throw from Queen's Park, Brian Lilly, political columnist for the Toronto Sun. And it's great to welcome you four onto our airwaves tonight. Melissa, I do want to start with you because my favorite quote of all time about the Premier was one you said right here on this program just after he got elected. He said, "The Premier is a bull who brings his own china shop with him wherever he goes." That is his style of leadership. That was certainly true in 2018 and 19. It doesn't seem to be true anymore. Let's find out why. Why do you think not?
Well, look, I think the populist label isn't for any politician that doesn't follow the mainstream, or who doesn't deviate from it, I should say. What you might be experiencing is actual empathy, emotion, and that's something that Ford had deep down inside. So some would say that this is the real Ford, and I think you're right in saying that you're not seeing that populist bent, if that's what you want to call it, because I think at the end of the day, all of the tenets of populism simply aren't there. He's embraced public health officials. He's abdicated most of the decision making responsibility to them, and that certainly isn't the Doug Ford that you would expect. But it's the one that got, frankly, a second chance to make a first impression.
Brian, how different is the 2020 version of Doug Ford from the one that got elected 2 years plus ago?
I think that there's a world of difference between the public persona and the actual man. Is there a difference in the men? Well, maybe in how they're reacting or interacting. But I think Melissa made a comment about maybe you're seeing the real Doug Ford. And I would actually have to agree with that. I got to know Doug Ford before he was in politics a little, and I've gotten to know him since, covering them the last 2 years. His public presentation is vastly different. He sometimes still calls out the media. Trust me on that. I've been on the receiving end of that. But he is mostly, as Melissa said, embracing public health officials. As far as populism goes, he is following where the majority of the public is. I don't know if he's leading where the majority of the public is, but he's definitely with where the population is. When you look at polling, Ontario is the most nervous, most skittish province in the country when it comes to COVID-19, despite when you look at the numbers, excluding Atlantic Canada, where they didn't have it hit as hard. Ontario is doing better than Quebec, better than Alberta, better than British Columbia. So, but he is following that same zeitgeist that the public has in terms of how they feel about this pandemic.
Jasveen, I want to, you're an intriguing inclusion in this group because you've only been a conservative for a little while, right? Can you just take us back? You were a liberal, or I should say your family generally, kind of leaned liberal before you joined the Conservatives. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's right, Steve. I have grown up in Canada and my family has been predominantly liberal. And so that's where I voted all my life. And when I made the decision to get involved in 2017, it was just issues I had with the current government at the time and wanted to see where I would fit. So the Progressive Conservatives was a place where I decided to call home. And there's many reasons for that. And I think that And back to what everybody else is saying here today, I mean, the premier has shown that he needs, I mean, first of all, he's in an unprecedented situation, and he showed that he needs to do what needs to be done in this situation. I think that for me, I feel that it's true to what I believe the progressive conservatives to be in terms of what I see, even with the definition of the names progressive and conservative. So for me, I believe that I'm glad that the premier is allowed to really show his true self, and I echo the sentiments of the other people in this chat as well.
Okay, well, let me do a follow-up with you, Jasmine, because if memory serves, you did not support the premier when he ran for the leadership of the party. This is going back to January of 2018. So I guess I'm curious as to, he wasn't your first choice then. How's he doing now?
To be honest, the premier has been, and I say this in my director of policy role at the PC Women in Politics, the premier has been more than supportive of the PC Women in Politics. For me, I've learned a lot since 2018. I guess for me, and mentioned this to you as well, Steve, that we had such great women candidates at that time running, and when we had 3 women candidates and one that wasn't, and someone that was new to this party, I guess I reflected on how could this be possible? But, you know, since then, and to be honest, since I've met the premier personally and see who he is and realizes, I believe that I'm very willing to support him. So,
Donald, I'm curious from your standpoint, which Doug Ford you like better? The bombastic bull who brought his China shop with him wherever he went 2 years ago, or the guy now who's trying to kind of channel his inner Bill Davis, if I can put it that way?
I first have to start by saying that no family in the history of the world is more cantankerous a bunch than the conservative family. You'll never meet a group of people that are constantly fighting and disagreeing or agreeing with each other, and it's one really, truly big tent. And so with that in mind, I don't like this constant comparison of Doug Ford to Bill Davis. There was only ever one Bill Davis. There was only ever one John Robarts, my favorite premier.
Is that his picture over your shoulder, incidentally?
That is his picture over my shoulder. That's supposed to be in Queen's Park. I have no idea how I got it, but
that's John Robarts.
That's John Robarts, the former premier, Prime Minister of Ontario. And the Doug Ford that we know today is really just an affirmation of the Doug Ford I think we knew we were going to get. It didn't seem like it at the time because it's party politics, it's electoral politics, and during a campaign, you're going to see the most bombastic parts of a leader in order to try and win an election. We also have to remember how Doug Ford came to be the Premier of Ontario and the leader of the Ontario PC Party. It was through a very difficult process, and as a result, we have now Doug Ford, and that's great for how quickly the party was able to move forward and end up winning the election. But I don't think that it's a shocker to see that Doug Ford, in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of what's going on right now, has sort of, if you want to say, turned the other cheek. I agree with Melissa. This is more of an empathy Doug Ford. This is more of a caring Doug Ford, and it was always there. If we look at the way that he responded when his brother, former mayor of Toronto, Rob Ford, died, I think that aside from the two of them being so close, you could really see the kind of person that Doug Ford really was. And even then, when he ran for mayor, a lot of people made the comparison between Doug and Rob, saying that Doug seemed to be more of the calmer, more sensible voice on city council some of the time, as opposed to the chaos of Rob Ford. I think today all we're seeing is a better, smarter leader. He's grown into the role. He's grown into it very well. He understands what needs to be done. I don't like this, again, comparison of Rob Ford to Bill Davis, or Doug Ford to Bill Davis, or Doug Ford to Larry Grossman, or Doug Ford to all these other fairly progressive leaders in the party's history, because there's only one Doug Ford.
No, I get you, Donald. I get you, but I have to say, I think it was back in March that the Premier started his daily briefings, and when he said the clip that I'm about to show you, well, well, I think it took a lot of people by surprise. Let's put it that way. Sheldon, let's roll that clip if you would.
I want to thank the media. You're playing a massive role in helping us out. I just want to thank you. There was an article in the Star. Yeah, the Star writes great articles.
Okay, Brian, when you heard that, what'd you think?
Look, Star does write great articles sometimes, and you know, in the media, we are competitors at times, and we also will read each other's stuff, watch each other's stuff, and yeah. So was I surprised by that? Not necessarily. At that point in particular, the government needed the media to get the message out. Look, I was at the very first press conference for COVID-19 arriving on January 25th. I'm, supposed to be getting ready to go to a Robbie Burns dinner, and I've got my kilt laid out ready to go, and I get the message saying, be at Queen's Park for 5. And all of a sudden, the world changes. But for, a month and a half, it was, don't worry, it's not that bad. And then overnight, everything changed, and they needed to get that message out. And so he relied heavily on the media for that. He's relied heavily on the media for his daily press briefings. I'm not sure that they still accomplish what they should. I think they should have ended a while back. The Prime Minister's down to 2 a day. John Tory in Toronto's down to 2 a day. The Premier should probably be...
Don't you? Don't you mean two?
Yeah, two a week. Sorry, 2 a week.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the Premier, heaven forbid they do 2 a day. My day would never end. But I think that the Premier probably should have done that. But he started to rely on the media because it does help his popularity. It does help show that other caring side of him. How long that'll last, we'll have to wait and see.
Well, that's a fact, Melissa. And the reality is he went from one of the most unpopular premiers in the country to one of the most popular in the country, first or second or third, depending on which poll you looked at. And presumably these daily briefings helped him. But I still need to know how did Doug Ford go from the guy who couldn't stand the Star, who was prepared to sue the Toronto Star, to a guy literally a few days after this pandemic broke who said, boy, the media is really helpful and the Star's got some great articles in it. How did that happen?
Well, I actually think it's much bigger than sort of any one media outlet, because if you look at it, the Conservatives generally rely on going over the media message through direct digital targeting. And frankly, the pandemic and the information regarding it just didn't allow them to do that. So to Brian's point, they actually needed the media to get the message out. With regards to governing from what I call the 1 o'clock podium, I think there's a real risk in that because we are all subject to sort of a communications rollout calendar where you need to fill in every day with an event, and the fear is that you're not actually planning. Look, this government started with a majority, a plan to get this the fiscal house in order in Ontario, and just overnight that has disappeared. So, whether it's the new Doug Ford, the old Doug Ford, or as a matter of circumstance, I think they're in a very different position. And I think Ontarians expect something very different from their government today than they did before that press conference that Brian went to in January.
Donald, maybe I can get you to weigh in on that. If there's got to be a difference of opinion, there is in every office, about how much to put the leader out there and how much to sort of keep the leader back a bit. And clearly this office, for better or for worse, has decided they want the Premier out there at Melissa's, as she calls it, 1 o'clock podium every single day, pretty much every single day. I think they took Remembrance Day off, but it's basically every day with a new announcement and then taking whatever it is, 15, 20, 30 minutes of questions from members of the media. Do you think the Premier's out there too much, or is it okay?
I agree that, at this point, there's probably not much of a reason to continue with such heavy daily briefings. We know what the score is right now, and I think a lot of people are kind of getting a pretty good picture of what the lay of the land is. They've got a good picture of the lay of the land. But this second wave, I think, is now going to challenge us a little bit more than the first. So there can be an argument made for him to continue to be out there and be at that 1 o'clock podium. I think for the way I see it, Doug Ford is doing his level best with the media because these are lessons that I think he's learned either through being at City Hall or in the very early part of his tenure as Premier. I think that by having those lessons come full circle in the middle of a pandemic has helped him greatly. I think that he's also built a pretty strong relationship with people that we never expected him to have, like Chrystia Freeland. The two of them have become buddy-buddy, which is kind of interesting to see. But I don't think that there's a real difference now that's been so great that we now have to say, is this a totally new Doug Ford? Is this something that we've never seen before? I think it's always been there. I think it just needed to make an appearance through something as big as this.
Okay, let me pick up on that angle, Donald. I want to pick up on the relationship angle because, you're quite right. The Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, in the past, I think, called Doug Ford my therapist because the two of them have so many calls in the middle of the night together trying to deal with this pandemic. We've heard the Premier say some wonderful things about the Prime Minister of the country. We've heard the Prime Minister say some wonderful things about Doug Ford. These were two people who had nothing nice to say about each other back in 2018 during the Ontario election campaign, and then again in 19 when the Prime Minister was running for re-election. Jasveen, my question, though, is with Doug Ford saying nice things about the media, with Doug Ford saying nice things about Liberals, do you think he is trying the patience of the Tory core of the party?
I guess, well, that's a couple of different things that we can address there. I think the first thing I would like to say is, and I think Melissa and Brian and everybody can describe to this, is that Conservatives have a really negative, I guess people have a negative opinion of Conservatives in the media in terms of what is being portrayed. I throughout my work and the things that I've done, I've met media several times, and throughout they say to me, "Oh, you're so nice and you're so this," and I said, "Well, tell your friends that Conservatives are nice," because I feel like this is the thing that's being portrayed, that we are all a specific way. So back to what you're saying, I feel that the Premier, and I think back to this being a unprecedented situation, something that government officials in this country really need to, I believe, put aside partisan politics and come together and really work for the people, which we know is Premier's slogan. I also think that one of the things, though, perhaps we can focus on, and perhaps maybe more pressure could come on, is maybe promoting testing, such as rapid testing, because that is something that will help to open the economy. And right now there seems to be a holdup with introducing that kind of testing within Canada for COVID. I apologize, it wasn't specific. And so I think that that's one way, perhaps, that in terms of moving forward, that maybe perhaps together they can come up with an agreement to that, and that would be very helpful, I think.
Brian, I wonder if you could build on that. Do you think the Conservative core of this party how do they feel about Doug Ford's increasingly good relationship with the federal government and move, if you like, more to the center of the political spectrum?
I think with voters in general, the wide voting population, it's probably playing well. How many times have we all heard over the past decades, "Oh, I just wish they would get together, stop fighting, work together." Well, they're doing that now. Sometimes Doug Ford is a bit too effusive in his praise for Justin Trudeau and the Liberals and Chrystia Freeland, more so than, it's not exactly an even two-way street. I've been to events and covered events where they're both speaking there, and the Premier is effusive in his praise of the Prime Minister, and Justin Trudeau will say a nice word or two. The Conservative base notices that and says, well, wait a minute, it's not reciprocal. And, eventually it's going to turn around. In fact, the Prime Minister has taken some pot shots. He did just last Friday over the shooting up at Jane and Finch in north end of Toronto. He was blaming the premiers for not allowing mayors to pass the handgun ban when asked about the shooting of the 12-year-old boy, that tragic shooting. Well, if you're working so well together, you don't do things like that. So Ford has to be wary of that for two reasons. One, it may play well with voters in general, but the volunteers that come out, they need to know that you're still on their team. He can say time and again, I don't care about blue team, orange team, red team, whatever team. Well, the people that you rely on to get reelected, they care about that greatly. And trust me when I say the Liberals always care about what team you're on, and it better be the red team or they're coming for you when it comes time to campaign. So I think that the Premier needs to waken up to that reality.
Melissa, how about that? Does the Premier have a bit of a problem with the Tory core of the party?
look, I think that, frankly, the premier might have a problem later on. I think right now we're still at the point where the virus is the enemy, and as we go through, whether it's the second, third, fourth, I don't purport to know how long we end up living with COVID as a crisis. But as soon as that as soon as the virus is not the enemy, the politician becomes the enemy. And frankly, there needs to be a wedge between the two of them. And now, with unprecedented spending in each level of of that government, and frankly, the lack of a plan on economic growth, there isn't necessarily the division that you would generally see between conservative and liberal policies. So you've got to be very careful, because you're going to have to go back to the electorate, give them your sales pitch, your 30-second elevator pitch about why you should either continue or why they should throw you out. And I'm not sure that necessarily it's so different on the issues, I think, that sort of rank at the top of the ballot of the average voter, that frankly swings between the two of them in this province.
Well, you'll recall a few moments ago we played a clip from Doug Ford from several months ago, which surprised a lot of people when he had nice things to say about the media. We're going to play another clip right now, and this is, again, Premier Ford at one of his daily briefings. And how do I put this one? Well, let's put it this way. Premier Ford got elected in part because he gave voice to a lot of people in this province who felt voiceless. They were mistrustful of public institutions, like, for example, medical officers of health. And then one day at a daily briefing, there were, I guess, a few dozen protesters on the south lawn of Queen's Park, declining to socially distance, declining to wear masks. And, well, the Premier was asked what he thought about those folks. Sheldon, the clip, please.
We have, a bunch of yahoos out in the front of Queen's Park sitting there protesting that the place isn't open, as they're breaking the law and putting everyone in jeopardy. These people that are absolutely irresponsible, it's reckless to do what they're doing. And personally, I think it's selfish.
Donald, what'd you think of that line?
I think he's right. And I think he had to say it. And I think this is the kind of Doug Ford that we had been used to, in that he would say something that off the cuff and that direct and that bold, but it's absolutely true. Regardless of how anybody agrees or what they think about this pandemic, or whether or not there should be lockdowns or anything like that, there's one very important thing to remember. You need leadership at this time. And that's I think what we're getting, by and large, from Doug Ford, is that sense of leadership, and the real leadership that speaks to those people who otherwise, as you said, felt voiceless, and communicating to them in a way that they can actually understand, instead of all the poly speak that the five of us here are very used to. He's speaking directly to people and saying, hey, look, don't be stupid. Don't do this. You're creating a bigger problem than there needs to be. I don't know that that's a bad thing. I also don't think that, just to an earlier point, and Brian had made this point as well, how do you, a leader is one that really does know how to work well with others. The person in Ottawa that's the racist fraud pretending to be the prime minister right now is not a good example of somebody who can lead and have that leadership trickle down into the provinces, by simply saying, like Brian had said, letting the provinces and the mayors deal with this order in council on the gun ban, as opposed to it being a federal issue and being dealt with at the federal level. This is leadership. This is what we're seeing. This is what we wanted. We've always wanted a leader that could speak clearly and speak directly to people. And when we finally get this person, people start throwing their hands up in the air and saying, well, this isn't what we wanted. This isn't what we expected. It is what we got, and we're doing fairly well by it. I think that this Doug Ford today has learned so much more, and I don't think his career is over either. I think he's got some bigger destiny for him than just the Premier's office at Queen's Park.
Well, we'll hold that off for another show. But Brian, let me get you to follow up on this aspect of it. Well, I'll put it this way. Former Conservative backbencher Amanda Simard left the party to go to the Liberals. Randy Hillier has left the party. He's an independent. Jim Wilson was booted out of the caucus. He's now an independent. Belinda Carahalios was kicked out of the caucus. She's now an independent. Now, losing 4 MPPs isn't the end of the world, but by the same token, it's more than normally happens in less than one full term. Do you think Conservatives are concerned that they represent a kind of canary in the coal mine as to the health of the PC party right now?
Look, if you look at how they all left, Jim Wilson left for personal reasons. Amanda Simard left because she thought she had greater opportunities with the Liberals. That was her end goal. Belinda Karahalios, I'm just waiting for her and her husband Jim to sue their own new party. And as far as Randy Hillier, that's the one that they should have been able to work out, but instead it was egos battling it out. So there are unique and bizarre stories behind each of them. If they were losing mainstream, moderate conservative voices, then I would say there's probably a problem. I've covered many of these people for a long time. I think that they're going to do just fine in most of those ridings come the next election. So, they're going to lose where Amanda Simard is. She was a fluke to win in a very francophone-heavy riding of Glengarry, Prescott, Russell in Eastern Ontario. And the Liberals are likely going to take that back next election. But the rest of them, the PC party will likely win those, and unless they're swept out of power, because the second half of the pandemic goes incredibly badly.
Jasveen, do you have any concerns about those four not being part of the PC family anymore?
Actually, no, I don't, Steve. I honestly believe, and I agree with Brian, I think at this point for me, there's so many different viewpoints in this party right now. And I've talked to you about this in terms of the definitions itself, progressive and conservative and self are conflicting in nature. And I believe that this is in part what the issues are within our party when we look at how do you identify who is a conservative. I mean, I've gone through this so many times when I was running and people were like, wow, you do all these things and you're a conservative? And I'm like, yes, I am. And so I think for me, where I see the party and the progressive conservative and the people that I know to be around me, I believe that the loss of these people, it's their decision, and they've made these choices as well, and have made their stand on where they sit. So,
Melissa, I do want to come back to that clip for a second here, because I suspect you could make an argument that the people that Premier Ford was calling those yahoos protesting on the lawn at Queen's Park probably voted for him. They're a more conservative-leaning group of people who don't want the government telling them how to live their lives, don't want the government telling them when they have to or don't have to put masks on, believe in personal freedom and the right of people to make their own decisions. And yet, if they were the base of Ford Nation, the Premier basically insulted them in front of everybody. How did you see that working out?
Well, I find it interesting that that you're playing clips of an empathetic premier in the middle of a pandemic, or that he does too many press conferences, and when he doesn't, he does not enough press conferences. So I'm not sure that he can ever get it right. But in terms of, there is a very reasonable conversation to be had about the lockdown measures, the rolling lockdown measures. These four aren't the people to have that conversation, and that's where the premier is lucky on that one. There is, I think, a good swath of conservatives who, frankly, don't believe that that we're taking the right approach, but generally public opinion does, and the premier is governing with that public opinion. So there really is no risk, because the messengers on this have started either their own party because of resentment, or are talking about internal party politics that doesn't actually galvanize a group around an issue. It just sort of rehatches like old conflicts.
I gotcha. And just to be clear, I'm not criticizing anything that the Premier is doing right here. I think the empirically provable facts, which are the public opinion poll surveys that I look at, show that people are quite happy with their Premier right now and with the PC party in general. So I'm just asking questions about what appears to be a fascinating transformation in the guy who got elected 2+ years ago and the guy who we see on television every day at 1 o'clock right now. Brian, let me get you to weigh in on another round here, and that is, I think it's fair to say he won the leadership back in in March of 2018, because he managed to convince enough social conservatives that he was for them, that he was open to their issues. But then he turfed Tanya Granick-Allen out of the party because of some things that she said. She was one of the leadership candidates. Yeah. And now he seems to be trying to sort of sneak through the back door some higher accreditation for Charles McVitie's Canadian Christian College. So can you help us understand what's going on here?
Well, look, normally the thing that you have to do to keep social conservatives on side with a conservative party is what Stephen Harper did. Don't make things worse. Don't antagonize them. Don't call them names. Um, Look, he partly won because of an overwhelming show of support from Tanya Granick-Allen, but also because Caroline Mulroney didn't deliver for Christine Elliott. So there were a couple of things going on in the leadership. As far as McVety goes, I know there's been a lot of gnashing of teeth in the gallery about this, but this is the same process that a bunch of different schools have had to go through. There's a Catholic college in Barry's Bay, Ontario, that I've spoken at several times. I don't think that you would find gay straight alliance clubs there, but they still went through the same process. And the premier at the time when they got accreditation was Kathleen Wynne. So, they'll go through the process. If they are approved by the academics, most of whom are Kathleen Wynne appointees, then they'll get it. If they don't, they won't. And the whole legislation issue, well, they have to have the legislation there for when the accreditation organization says yay or nay. They still haven't proclaimed it for Algoma. They haven't proclaimed it for the Ontario College of Art and Design, even though that was passed a year ago. So people may be reading a lot more into the Charles McVety thing than they need to on all sides.
Yeah, and let's point out that I think it was Dalton McGuinty's government, a Liberal government, that allowed Redeemer College to be now called Redeemer University. That is a religious-based organization in the outskirts of Hamilton. So yes, this has happened before, nothing new here. But Jasmine, I wonder, just asking the question here, I wonder if what the Premier appears to have tried to do on this Canadian Christian college story, while it may be good for his social conservative base, do you worry that it puts him offside with the majority of people in Ontario?
To be honest, I don't know if the majority of, and not to be rude, Steve, but I to be honest, I don't know if the majority of people of Ontario are really that concerned about it, and I could be wrong more with everything else going on with the pandemic. However, I do want to bring about a point that, for me, this issue, especially when you look at the things that the New Blue Party is talking about, and especially specifically related to Belinda Carvalho's talking about Bill 168 and how, sorry, was it 168, and how it is creating an issue, and how they're creating an issue and saying that it's going against the rights of women to change their surnames and from there on. And when I looked at the stats and I was listening to her speak, one of the things that stood out to me is, and when I read about it, was that there was only 375 people out of 60,000 people in 2019 who had gotten married who were actually worried about this change in the law. So I guess back to the same point with the Christian college, perhaps in terms of the voter base is the Premier's voter base in terms of the party that may have an effect, but I feel that the messaging of the party is becoming clearer, and as it's going on, people are starting to move away, and whatever way that is, it's happening. So.
Okay, in our remaining moments here, let's come full circle, and we'll come back to the New Blue Party, which we started the program, which the Carvalho couple are trying to set up right now. Melissa, if there are disaffected Conservatives out there who don't like what they're seeing with the current Ontario PC party, how does the New Blue Party look to you as a potential alternative?
Well, I'm not sure that's an actual serious potential alternative. I said before that party based on frankly on resentment about how its individual leaders have been treated by the party is not the party that the reasonable conservative who's challenging the government's agenda is going to look to. I think there's always a risk for conservative parties to split on the right, and as a result make it difficult to get reelected, because I think that I can say this with some certainty. There are more progressives in Ontario than conservatives. So frankly, an ununited party on the right is a very dangerous game for conservatives, but these aren't the people that are going to make that happen.
Brian, what do you say?
I already said I'm waiting for Jim Carvalho to sue his own party. He sued the Federal Conservative Party. He sued the Ontario PC Party. He will eventually sue his own party. But Melissa's right. He is building a party based on resentment, much like Maxime Bernier, Bernier, was just a sore loser that he didn't win the federal leadership, and then ran on a bunch of things that he had never raised in cabinet, that in the 10 years I covered him on Parliament Hill, he never talked about, and suddenly it became the thing. So I'm expecting Bernier-level success for the new Karahalios party.
Okay, well, let me follow up with you on that, because there were allegations made by Jim Karahalios about the way the party did some of its business. For example, nomination meetings that took place in the lead up to the 2018 election. And there were, for example, in one of the Eastern Ontario ridings around Ottawa, there were X number of names on a list allowed to vote. And then when they counted up the number of votes, there were more ballots in the ballot boxes than names on the list. And Karahalios has concluded someone tried to stuff the ballot boxes. That's a fairly reasonable conclusion to come to, is it not?
Oh, absolutely. If you're talking about Ottawa West Nepean,
yeah,
I covered that. I covered that extensively when I was in Ottawa on 580 CFRA, the radio station there, and said that there needed to be an airing on this. There were many, but those were all prior to the current people running the party. That was under a previous leader and a previous bunch of people at the top of the party. I always think that parties need to clean up their acts on these things, and we can look to both the Liberals and the NDP on that as well. Not to the same degree as happened in that lead up in 2017-18, but Jeremy Roberts was denied a fair vote. He eventually got one, and now he's the MPP for Ottawa West Nepean. There were a few others, and yeah, those things always have to be stamped out.
Well, Donald, let me follow up with you on this. One of the things that Belinda Karahalios said she was really offended by was the lack of what she called, simple democratic process in the PC party. For example, all the candidates for the next election are being appointed. There's no running for nominations anymore, which she believes is an integral part of democracy. Does she have a point?
Yes, she does. However, I think that with the Karahalios, I think that the thing to remember is there's a difference between opportunity and good intentions. And I only ever see now Belinda and Jim as opportunists, and not so much as concerned about the ultimate goal of conservatism in Ontario and the party's successes going forward.
But if I can jump in there, Donald, they don't see the Ontario PC party as a vehicle for conservatism anymore. That's why they say they're starting their own.
Well, this is what I said at the start is you'll never meet a group of more cantankerous family members than conservatives, because not one will ever agree with another, but we all still end up voting one way or the other for a conservative. What's great is if you look at the history of conservatism in this country, and even in this province, the conservative movement has always been mobile and shifting and changing. It's always very dynamic, and there's always some kind of splinter group or some people that are just disappointed or downright upset with the way things are going, and they start their own party. And that's just kind of, to me, that's a virtue of conservatism that's great, is that if you're not happy with the way things are going, fine, you can go off and start your own party. Never mind the fact that you're going to split votes and you're going to cause problems for the electoral process. I'm a conservative who wants to win. I don't care about this new blue party because it will not help us win. It won't get us any closer to getting elected.
Well, I'm down to my last 30 seconds here. Let me make sure I get Jasveen in on this too. Jasveen, how do you see the prospects of the new blue party?
To be honest, I agree with everyone here. I at this point, I think it's just a gimmick. I don't know the Karahalios as well, but what I've seen in the last several years, to me, as someone who has been an outsider coming in, seems to echo the sentiments of everyone else here as well. At the end of the day, if they want to go in, that's the one great thing about Canada, right? We have the right to a democratic process, and if they want to start a party, good for them. So, but I'm very willing to stick with the party that I'm part of right now, and I support them.
Gotcha. Well, I really want to thank all of you for gathering virtually anyway for this discussion. I really look forward to the day when we can do it all in person. But in the meantime, Donald Blair in the top left corner, Jasveen Rattan in the top right corner, and Brian Lilly in the bottom left corner, and Melissa Lantzman in the bottom right corner. We're delighted all of you could join us on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you so much.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.